Okay. Okay. Next, Leo is impressed with Gao Wenzhong's house and says this: 你们家很大，也很漂亮. Okay? And the only thing here you're not familiar with is this 漂亮, which means pretty. Now, in a minute, when I let you know, pause and think about what this means, because there's some grammar here that poses some difficulty for non-Chinese speakers, especially English speakers who are learning Chinese. Because you'll notice in here the word for is or to be, the Chinese is 是, right? It's 是. Okay, for example, let me jump to another slide. Okay, this 是 right here, 是. That's the standard Chinese translation for is, right? Or are. But think about this. 你们家很大，也很漂亮. So translate that into English. And when you translate it into English, you need is. You need that verb, is, in order to have a proper predicate. But do you see it here? No, you don't. And there's in the grammar section of the textbook, this is addressed. And there's this sentence right here is an example. And there's one coming up in a little bit. But you notice there's no is here. But you need the is in English. So you need to be careful when you're translating from English to Chinese. You're going to be very tempted to put that is in there or are. And I see some of you doing that on the workbook exercises or the tests. And there are some places where the is cannot be there in Chinese. So pause if you want and write down what you think this sentence means. Okay, here we are. Your house is big and also very pretty. Okay, and so in your textbook on page 126, grammar point number 2, it talks about adjectives as predicates. Okay, if you remember grammar, the predicate is every sentence in English or simple sentences are subject and predicate. And the subject is, for example, a person, like my house, a thing, person, place, or thing. My house. That's the subject. Is very big. That's the predicate. Is very big. And predicates in English are verb phrases. Obviously, if they're a verb phrase, it means there's a verb in it. And in this case, the verb in the predicate, my house is very big, the verb is. Okay? But in Chinese, adjectives act as predicates. You can have a predicate in Chinese with no verb, just an adjective. And here's an example. Your house, very big. That's why, you watch a movie or something and there's Chinese people in the movie and their English is not so good, right? And, sometimes people might make fun of that. But you'll notice in Chinese movies, Chinese will speak this way. Oh, your house, very big. Your house, very pretty, right? And we think it's kind of funny because they forgot to say is. They didn't say, your house is big. They say, oh, your house big. Your house pretty. Okay? What they're doing is they're speaking very correct Chinese grammar, but using English words. Okay? And so we need to remember not to do that when we're going from English to Chinese. So in Chinese, be on the lookout. Be thinking ahead when you're looking at new Chinese sentences or Chinese sentences that you've studied previously. That remember, adjectives can act as predicates in some cases. And there are several examples on page 126, number 2. So you might want to pause and go look at page 126, grammar point number 2, or go take a look at everything in the grammar section after this video. And you can see some examples of adjectives being used as predicates. But here are 2 very common examples. Your house, very big. Also, very pretty. Okay? And when we translate that into English, we have to put the is here, because our predicates need a verb. All English predicates need verbs in them. In some cases, Chinese sentences don't. Okay. Next, Xiaoyan is, listening to that 你们家很大很漂亮 at the compliment. And when you compliment a Chinese, the standard cultural Chinese response is to be humble about it. Chinese are very, very humble, and they always treat praise, open praise, especially in public, they always respond to praise in a very humble fashion. And it doesn't matter whether it's sincere humility or just a show. That's not the point. That's not even part of the discussion. It's just the culture. It's what's polite. Okay? In our culture, it's polite to chew with your mouth closed. Right? Many cultures around the planet, chewing with your mouth open or closed doesn't matter. And in some cultures, chewing with your mouth open very loudly is actually a compliment, because it means it tastes good. So it's like a compliment to the chef in some cultures. What's polite in one culture is not necessarily polite in another. So don't analyze Chinese, how they respond to praise. Just remember that if you're in China and someone's praising you, you should probably try and respond very humbly. Because if you don't, it would be the equivalent of someone chewing with their mouth open in front of you. You would be very disgusted by it. And the Chinese are very disgusted when someone praises someone and then that person's like, oh yeah, thank you, I know, I'm so great. You can't do that. So Xiaoyan's house was just praised by Wang Peng and Liu as being very big and very beautiful. And then she responds by saying, 是吗? Right? And really, so this response really is it's big and beautiful? No. 是吗? And then she says, 请坐. So we see this please again. And 坐 means to sit. So I think you can figure out what that means. Really? Please sit. Or sit down. So Wang Peng begins to make some small talk. 小燕，你在哪儿工作？小燕，你在哪儿工作？ So most of this you know, all of this you know, except for this 在哪儿. So 在哪儿 simply means where. Okay? It's one of the ways to ask where. There's another way to ask where. I don't think we've seen it yet, but we will in future units. But 在 indicates a location. It's kind of like at. And then 哪 is where. Third tone. 哪 is where. And then I have this R here, and I didn't copy it down, but this R should probably be brought down. There we go. Okay. 在哪儿. So this R, you're going to see this more often. It's part of the typical Beijing or Mandarin dialect. They don't do this in all of China. It's very typical of Beijing and very typical of the standard Mandarin dialect. They have this R on the end of everything. So really it should be at the base of it, it's 在哪, right, without this R. But then they add the R on it, so it sounds like 哪. And this R, the best way I can think of how to pronounce it properly is the way a pirate says R. R. Yeah, I don't probably do that very well, but anyway, that's how that's pronounced. So there's a grammar point on page 128, point number 3. You might want to go take a look at more about 在. So, 小英, 你在哪工作? And pay attention to the word order here too, because think about what this sentence means first. But in English, this where would go first, and then the you would go second, and then this would go at the very end, right? So pay attention to the typical Chinese expression. So if you came up with 小英, where do you work? You were right. Where, 在哪, you work. Where you work. Okay. Now in English, to make a question, you notice there's all different ways in Chinese to ask questions. You know, 你喜欢不喜欢 or 你喜欢吗? Right? So one of the ways that we ask questions in English is to use do. Do you? Right? And for people who study English, the whole idea of having to use a whole other verb like do you watch movies? Do you eat Chinese food? Do you do this? Do you do that? The whole idea of us having to use this do to ask questions is very inefficient. And lots of languages get by asking questions without having to add in an extra verb like we do. So you'll notice here that we have to add it in. Where do you work? But in Chinese, it's very efficient. You, where, work. You, where, work. 你在哪儿工作? This is the proper word order. You can't say 在哪儿你工作? Can't say it. Right? 你在哪儿工作? That's the proper expression right there. So Gao Xiaoyan responds, 我在. So there's the 在. So in the question you had 在哪儿. So in the answer, 你, in the question, 你在哪儿工作? So in the answer, she changes the 你 to I because it's her. I, and then we have the 在, and then the 哪儿 is replaced with the place that she works at. And then 工作 is still the same. See, we'll just back up. 你在哪儿工作? So the answer, the 你 changes the 我, and the 哪儿, where, changes to the actual place. And everything else is the same. 在 and 工作 is the same. 我在学校工作. 学校 means school. 我在学校工作. And then she asks a couple questions. She says, 你们想喝点儿什么? 喝茶还是喝咖啡? Now this 咖啡, you should know. You should be able to guess what this means. And if you can guess 咖啡 correctly, then can you guess what cha means? Okay.